Please welcome my ultimate friend, the ultimate author, and the person that gave birth to the book of being, the book that has transformed so many lives. Please welcome her up here, Amy Blake Hardison.
Thank you for being here. Alan, Karan, you're amazing. Absolutely amazing. And the team, you know, you can tell from Steve, everything about Steve. You can tell from how he dances, you can tell from how he lives, you can tell from how he coaches that he's powerful. You get the power that Alan is, the amazing intelligence he has, the grace that he has in front of a group of people. You get Karan, you know, we're all just in the palm of his hand, laughing and being inspired. There's so much power in this room, but there is so much love. And that is what moves me to my very core. So thank you. Back in 2019, I planned a trip to Scotland for Steve and me. We're moving to that stage in our life where we're doing a little bit more traveling, our kids are raised. I was excited about it, had everything paid for, all the reservations, and then COVID hit. Just a couple months before we were to go. So that vacation got shelved. And back in October of 2020, we thought, okay, we can probably do this. We can probably plan this for the next spring. And I think it's going to happen. We'll cross our fingers. And then in January, Matt Smith contacted Steve, and he had become aware of the Ultimate Experience Arizona. And he had this vision to create the Ultimate Experience, the London edition. And he wanted to create it while we were here in Scotland. Well, I'd already had some plans. I'd already paid for some tours and working out the dates. It took us a little while. There's a little bit of scheduling conflict, and then we got it done. But I want you to know that my Scotland trip became a Scotland trip with a day to just make this little jaunt down to London and then go back and continue our vacation. And I want you to know that what I have observed for the last 4 months, I have watched this magnificent commitment. I have watched people give so much. I have watched so much work be done. If you notice, every single detail is handled. You can't imagine the phone calls, the Zoom calls that we've had for people who just said, how can we serve you? How can we make this work for you? Let me tell you what I'm doing. How can this work for you? And it's like they're doing so much. And I want you to know that over the course of this event, that my trip to Scotland has become my trip to the UK for the ultimate event. And we'll squish in a little bit of Scotland here and afterwards. But this is why we're here. And this is an incredible experience to be here and to see and to feel so much love. So all I can say is thank you. Just really, really thank you. In the Book of Being, Martine Cannon tells the story of coming to meet Steve for the very first time. And she ended up coming to the funeral of my father and mother. Here's a picture of my mom and dad and me. They are amazing human beings. We called their funeral the Sweetheart Funeral because my parents passed just 6 days apart, and there were 2 caskets. Some people thought they were just coming to my mom's funeral, if you can imagine walking in and seeing 2 caskets. So it was a little bit of a shock for some people. But I have no doubt that my dad waited for my mom before he passed. For the previous 6 months, we thought that my dad would pass first. But I know that he stayed because he felt like he had to help my mom. Now you have to know they are both in hospital beds, laying next to each other, holding hands. It's not like my dad could really do a whole lot for my mother at that stage, but he was her knight in shining armor. And the reason he had to wait for her is because for the previous 10 years, my mom had had a long, slow decline to dementia. And if you've not walked through this with someone you love, this is not pretty. There is so much that is hard about it. It's hard to see people who were previously intelligent, vibrant, active, become just a shell of themselves. It's hard to take away their car keys. Not because it's car keys, but because it's their independence. It's hard to talk to someone who can't remember what they did the night before. You can't say, well, Dad, did you guys watch a movie last night? What did you do this morning? It's gone. We got to the point where I would come in and I'd give them a running monologue of my life and my family, and because there was no ability to interact. So they enjoyed that. We would sing songs. I printed out the lyrics of all the show tunes that they loved from the 1940s and the songs that they loved, and would go and would sit and I would sing songs with them. I would go into my grandkid closet and get the games I played with my 3-year-old granddaughter and take them to my parents' house and play them with them. And there was one particular game, we called it the cupcake game. I think maybe in England you'd call it the fairy cakes. Is that right? Steve had to tell me you may not use the word cupcakes. But it's one of those games, if you play with kids, there's a spinner, and like each little slot has a different ingredient. So you need to get the wet ingredients or the dry ingredients or the flavoring, and you spin it, and your intentions to get all of these. And we were sitting there playing, and after about 10 or 15 minutes, my mom said, Amy, you didn't tell me this was going to be so hard. So about 9 months before my mom passed, I had taken her to a neurologist. And the neurologist said he was going to ask her some questions. First, he asked her what month it was. She said, the hot one. We live in Arizona. That's 12 of the months. Okay, so that was a good bet. He asked her where she lived. She said Phoenix. She lived in Gilbert, which is a suburb of Phoenix. She had lived in Phoenix, but we hadn't lived there since 1971. He asked her what county Phoenix was in, and her eyes lit up, and she said, Maricopa. And so these questions continued. And the doctor left the room for a minute, and my mom looked at me, and she had such deep sadness in her eyes. And she said, I didn't do very well, did I? And the doctor came into the room, and he handed her a pencil and a paper, and he asked her to write down a sentence. She wrote, I have a wonderful life. At this point in her life, she had no memory. She had very little of her mental powers left. She really had very little of her physical powers. This was a woman until into her 80s was climbing the most difficult mountain, climbing Camelback Mountain once a week, but not at this point. But who she was left with, at her core, was her being. And at her being, she was gratitude, she was optimism, and she was that she had a wonderful life. See, being is everything. And being is the key to having a wonderful life. So in my time with you today, I'm going to talk about several things. They may even seem unrelated, but they are all about being. And ever since the book about being, The Ultimate Coach, has come out, we're talking about being a lot. But as you know, there is not one definitive way to be, not one definitive way of being. There's not one universal state of being. There are a lot of states of being. And the ones that I am going to talk about today are the ones that are important to me. They're the ones that I have found valuable in my life. And they may or may not be the ones that you find valuable. But if you don't relate with them, I ask you to look for the underlying principle, because the principles are the same. So the first thing I wanted to share with you, it takes a little bit of courage because there's some vulnerability involved. If you play cards, you'll know what I mean when I say I am not leading with my strong suit. Okay? So in the midst of preparing my remarks that I was going to make here today, I had two experiences on one day, on the same day. The first involved someone named Dr. Will Moreland. He's an amazing person. He's an international speaker, an author, a coach. He's the president of a leadership training company, a diversity champion, a powerful, dynamic man. He's the creator and editor of I Dominate magazine, which is a magazine for speakers. And I was very honored when he came to me and he said that he wanted to nominate me to be one of the 44 phenomenal women of 2022 that he featured in his magazine. So on April 4th, he sent me a link and said, okay, it's gone live today. And he's had this message with it. He said, I believe Amy Hardison has written the book of the decade. So I opened it up, scrolled through the magazine, read about these women. Do you know what I thought? I thought, I don't belong here. I haven't done the kinds of things the women have done. I just kind of snuck in. So on the very same day, I got an email. A few days before this, our church had changed the leadership of their children's organization, the ones that are over the organization for the whole world. And I got an email in my box that's just like, do you want to meet these women? Not personally, like this general email, like get to know about who these women are. And so I clicked it and I started reading. One was a lawyer at an impressive law firm. Another was on the animation team for the church and had worked with Disney Interactive Studios for 13 years. Another one was involved in some really big community organization things. And I had the very same experience. I thought, wow, I could never do what these women do. And it's like, dang, I lived this little life. And I thought, what's going on? I thought 98% of the time, I really love who I am. I love my life. I love the choices I've made that have created the life that I live. I have my document. I create myself. So why do thoughts like this kind of creep in, kind of like weeds, just when life was going along so well? Well, I believe it kind of goes with being human. And at least maybe for like 98% of the people. But I also know there's certain situations that evoke these kinds of thoughts. And as a career stay-at-home mom, one of the things I always hated is when we went to business dinners or business functions and people would say, so what do you do? And I thought, I love what I do. It's important. It's filled with joy. It has purpose. It's meaning. But I can't take what I do and put it in this little sound bite as you pass the conversation around the table. And so I hated it. And I've talked to other stay-at-home moms who felt the same thing. So I thought, oh, it's the career choice. And then I was reading a book. You're going to find I say that a lot in what I share with you because I'm always reading books. So I was reading this book called Becoming Better Grown-Ups by Brad Montague. And he said, the question that strikes terror in my heart, though, is so what do you do? I thought, oh, look, someone else thinks the same thing. And he talked about it. And he says he fantasizes about just straight up lying. He says, I'm tempted to say my name is Brad and I'm a doctor. And he said, but what happens if someone chokes while we're eating and someone says, is there a doctor in the house? And everyone turns and points to him and says, he's a doctor. And he's like, then I have to get up and either try to, make my way through this charade, or they're all going to know that I am the fraud I have always been. So he was invited, he and his business partner were invited to the Jefferson Awards in Washington, D.C., founded in 1972 by Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. And it was a great honor for him to be there and to have his work recognized. And it was one of those things where they go into the room and the tables are all set up and they walk around the tables and they found where their names were. So he just kind of looked over to see who he was going to be sitting next to. And he said, he looked at the card, and it was none other than Justice Sonia Sotomayor of the U.S. Supreme Court. Supreme Court Justice. She is a Supreme Court Justice. So what do you do, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor? Those of you who are Brits, the Supreme Court Justice is the top Supreme Court in the whole United States. So he says, I was wondering how I'd ever be able to tell her I just make silly YouTube videos for a living. She was, after all, someone in the midst of making history. She was making a massive difference in the world. So as they ate dinner, he would steer the conversation away from any interest in himself. He said, but then it happened. She was leaning towards him with great interest. He could tell the question was coming. And he said, please ask me to pass the salt. Please ask me to pass the salt. She didn't want the salt. So she said, tell me, what do you love about what you do? He relates, silence. What do I love about what I do? Did I hear that correctly? Now this I could answer. This unlocked in me a fury of words. I love getting to work with young people. I love getting to make things that I needed when I was a kid. I love getting to simply create. I love. These words spilled out of me. As the evening ended and people started to say goodbye, he made his way over to Justice Sonia Sotomayor, and he thanked her and he told her how nervous he had been to sit next to her. And she laughed and he felt relieved. And they talked and he asked her how she responds to the question, so what do you do? Or she shared that and Brad was shocked. He assumed most people would know. And she said, actually, most people don't recognize me. And they do say, so what do you do? And he says, interestingly, she doesn't leap to say, oh, I'm a Supreme Court Justice. He goes, I'd likely get T-shirts printed and vanity license plates for my car. And I'd make certain to announce that my role as someone who officially had a job for life. When people ask her what she does, her response is not to give her title. Her response is not about her rank. Her response is about who she really is, which is to say, it is what she loves. She says she tells people, hello, my name is Sonia, and I help people. I try to give voice to people in need. Now, how can I help you? Let me share with you another story. This is a story told by a woman named Regina Ellis. And she says when she was first married, she decided she was going to have perfect kids. No drippy noses, no dirty hands. They would be clean, they would be smart, they would be polite. Her fourth son, as a baby, never learned to breathe through his mouth. So whenever he had a cold, He woke up as soon as his nose got plugged. And one time she had been up with him for 2 nights in a row every single hour. She was tired. She was exhausted. She prayed that he would sleep just this one night, but he kept waking up. And she says that about the 3rd time she was so mad at the baby and felt so sorry for herself that she stomped into the nursery, grabbed him up out of his bed, began pacing the floor, insisting, "Go to sleep, go to sleep." She said suddenly, for the first time in her life, words came into her mind. "You've got to take the bad with the good." She recognized it as the voice of God, and the message stopped her in her tracks. And then she says this, "I needed to learn this hard lesson because 3 years later, a car hit and severely injured this child. Besides the broken bones and punctured lung, Frank suffered brain damage and was in a coma. The doctors could not assure us that he would live, or if he lived, that he could function. I said many prayers, once in the restroom in the once in the restroom just off the intensive care waiting room, I shut the stall door. I knelt down and begged God to let me keep this child, no matter what he would be like. I wasn't after the perfect child anymore. I just wanted him to stay." For a second time, words came into my mind. "I will consider what you say, for you are his mother." And with the word mother came such a feeling of approval. My mouth hung open. I was amazed that God felt this way about me and about the role of mother. You may not be a mother. You may not be a father. You may not believe in God, but adapt this to your belief system and your situation. I'm asking you to identify the person or the being whose stamp of approval would be the most validating in the whole world for you. And imagine that person saying, "Oh my goodness, you are a mother. You are a coach?" Or, "Oh my goodness, you are a kindergarten teacher?" Or, "Oh my goodness, you are an accountant?" That is so amazing. Now, this is a creation. Alan Alda, those of you who are old enough to remember MASH or have seen the reruns, said it this way: "It seems to me that your life will have meaning when you can give meaning to it, and not until then, because no one else will give meaning to your life. There isn't a job or a title or a degree that has meaning in itself." Now, I want to practice creating this for just a minute. I remember way back when I was a kid in grade school, learning about math. And I remember them talking about the lowest common denominator. Well, the creation I'm talking about is finding the highest common possibility. For Justice Sonia Sotomayor, the highest possibility of a Supreme Court justice was, "I help people. I give a voice to people in need." So I want to do, for just a minute, a little bit of interaction here. So, what is the highest common possibility that you could say for a teacher? Let's get 3 or 4 or 5 responses. Just raise your hand or shout them out. What is the highest common possibility for a school teacher? I shape the future, right? Yes. Okay, say it one more time really loud. I make an impact for young people. I inspire the next generation. Good. What's another one? Yes. I allow my children to, awesome, understand. All right. If you are an Uber driver, what's your highest common possibility? Yes. I connect people. Awesome. What else? Yes. I can't, there's a little bit of noise back here on this, so it's a little bit hard for me to hear. So I thank you. And here is actually my strong point anyway. I get precious cargo where they need to go. Awesome. What else? Back here. All right. By way of Quran. Thank you. So, what about something like I own a bakery? I feed people. Yeah. I do what to people in my community? Nourish people in my community. I love that. Anyone else? Oh, I love people feel warm and toasty. I love that. Yes. Give people their daily bread. I think you're getting the idea. You know, who are you? Okay, at the beginning of in the book, in the book of being entitled The Ultimate Coach, at the beginning of the document chapter, Steve is walking his client, Aaron Donovan, out to her car. And as they are, our neighbor and client, Dustin, drives by and stops and says hi. You probably remember this. And Steve says, well, let me introduce you. Our neighbor says, hi, I'm Dustin. I exist to serve. And Aaron says, hi, I'm Aaron. I have the smile of the universe. I'd like you to turn to the people on each side of you and consider your document. Consider who you are. Consider how you've created yourself and what you do in the world as generated by your being. And I want you to share that. I could say, hi, I'm Amy. I create an environment for the human beings I love the most in the world to thrive and reach their highest potential, to feel safe and loved so they can go out and change the world. Hi, I'm Amy. I write books that help people find possibility, freedom, and joy with language that is clear and powerful, engaging, and delightful. All right, so turn to your neighbor. So you have two opportunities, most of you, and introduce yourself. Hi, I am. Thank you. Whoa. Thank you. I see possibility out there. It's moving, it's going. Yoo-hoo. Thank you. Go Quran. I hope you had fun with that, and I hope that it's something that you can keep sharing with each other. All right. I would next like to talk for a little bit about relationships, it seems like people are intrigued with our relationship. And I think it's partly because Steve is so amazing and powerful and enigmatic. It's partly because Steve speaks so powerfully about our relationship, and it's partly because there's something so elusive about relationships in general. You know, and we're kind of fed from the time we're little. There's chick flicks and chick lit and fairy tales, hopes and dreams. And in the real world, relationships are just plain hard. And you can look around and our success rate isn't that great. So I want to start with a fun story, meaning this one's not true. But my others are. I'm actually pretty literal. So the others are, at least as far as I know. This one's not. There was a young couple that they gave birth to the son, and they named him Amazing. And they hoped that somehow he would live up to his name and do something great, but he never really did. He just did ordinary things. He never really accomplished anything great. He married, lived on a family farm, raised a family, and was the brunt of jokes all his life because of his name. So finally, as he said to his wife, "When I die, please do not put my name on the tombstone. Maybe that will stop all the jokes." And so later he did die, and she was true to her promise, but she thought, I need to put something on this headstone. And so she wrote, "Here lies a man who loved and was faithful to his wife for 60 years. And now people read the inscription and they point and say, that's amazing." So I want to tell you about an amazing love story. Can I have picture number 2, please? You might recognize them. So I have 2 sisters, 3 brothers, and it took all of the girls and 2 full-time caregivers to take care of my parents in their last years. And it was one of the greatest privileges of my life. And Clara, our main caregiver, was an angel. And one morning she sent us a video, and my mom and dad are sitting at their kitchen table. And at this time, my mom is 89 and my dad is 93. So this is 1 year before they passed. They had been married for 70 years. And in this video, my mom is a little bit exasperated. And she says, "Kent, why do you think your life is over?" And he says, "Well, I've done everything I've needed to do." And my mom said, "You haven't been married to me long enough." And he said, "You're right, I haven't." So what is their secret? What is the secret? Well, it's no surprise. It's your way of being. That's a given. But once again, I have to go back and say, but what ways of being? And I'd like to share a few. Once again, there's not right ones, but these are ones that have worked for us, or ones that have been helpful, especially for me. So our next picture, please, picture number 3. In the delightful little book, maybe many of you have read it, The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse, we read, "The great illusion is that life should be perfect." And notice there are spots all over the page. But the key is in the caption down on the bottom, in the footnote. It says, "My dog walked over the drawing, clearly trying to make the point." Condoleezza Rice, who is a former U.S. Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, an amazing woman, one that I admire deeply. She wrote a book called Democracy, Stories from the Long Road to Freedom. And in it she said, "Every democracy is flawed at its inception. And indeed, no democracy ever becomes perfect. The question is not of perfection, but how an imperfect system can survive move forward, and grow stronger. That is true of democracies, and it is true of relationships. Remember that that story I told you about the baby that didn't sleep? It was kind of a two-part story. I could have just told you the second part, the part about I will consider what you say, for you are his mother. But I included two parts on purpose because there was an important line in the first part. And that was when God said to Regina, you have to take the good with the bad. That is true with babies and democracies and relationships. So the first state of being for me in a relationship is you have to take the good with the bad. None of us is perfect. All of us have habits and quirks and habits that will drive another person crazy. And it's really hard for a relationship to thrive when you think, I love you, except when you leave your stuff out all over. Or I love you except when you yell. Or I love you except when you are boring. So in my document, my statements is, I love Steve with all of my heart. He is the love of my life. It is a privilege to be his wife. I cherish every moment we have together. I embrace our differences for their richness and growth. The first four statements, those are easy. The last one is a creation. And it's not always easy, but I do choose to see our differences, which are, we're as polar opposite. Notice I'm not up here dancing. Notice Steve is not going to be standing behind a podium. That's typical of everything about us, okay? That's just, it says it all, okay? So I choose, first of all, to see a richness in our differences. Byron Katie, in a course we were in with her, once said, if you marry someone who loves what you love and does what you do, one of you is redundant. Now, that's not redundant in the English sense, like being laid off from your job. That's redundant in the American sense, meaning it's not needed because it's just the same. So now the growth. There are lots of ways to use your differences for growth. One of them is to use them for practices in being loving. Another is to use it as a practice to transcend the ego that is so dominant for us as human beings, which includes being egocentric, being right, insisting that your way is the right way to do things. That is the hard work of relationships. So I shared this on my podcast with Philip Barker. Where's Philip? You know, he's here somewhere. Oh, here's Philip. Thank you. I love you, Philip. So I shared this somewhat, I think, fairly spontaneously. It was easy because we were doing this Zoom call at my computer. But I'd like to share it with you. So these are things I read frequently. I don't even read them every single day, but I do read them frequently. And as I go through my day and I go through our life and we go through our upsets in the present tense, as I go through our upsets, I will go to these statements, not every single one of them, but I'll go to 2 or 3 of them to help me stay centered. So these are the things that are helpful for me to ask myself. What is the most loving thing I can do or say right now? How quickly can I let go of this? Do a turnaround and find something positive regarding this particular thought. Is what I am doing, saying, or thinking separating us or bringing us closer? Where is my ego in this? Quote, there is real power in learning how to agree with others. End quote. Find 5. Find 5 things Steve did today that were wonderful and amazing and express that to Steve. What are 3 ways in which Steve's response is better than my natural response would have been? Why am I doing what I am doing and what I am saying right now? Where is my growth edge? How can I use this to practice love? Where am I being right? Think about a situation, replay it, practice the most enlightened response possible. Where has my mind gone down the road and made up things? Did I slow down my thinking and responses? What is my part in this? Am I seeing myself without deception? Have I considered Steve's viewpoint? How would things be different if I did? Am I doing the right thing, but doing it without love or fully giving of myself? What is the bigger picture? Am I getting caught up in details that don't matter? Quote, "Be curious, not judgmental," by Walt Whitman. Ask myself why Steve is doing something or saying something instead of making him wrong. Am I going to war in my mind? Where can I be more flexible? Where can I find a third way that works for both of us? And at the end of this, I have this quote by Blake T. Osler. Good and evil can be defined slowly in terms of the law of love. A good act is one that leads to healing a broken relationship or a growing in intimacy and meaning in existing relationships. In contrast, an evil act is whatever injures or destroys a relationship or leads to alienation or separation. We know that violating the law of love is a foolish choice to be miserable rather than to experience happiness and joy. And it is utter stupidity of the silliest sort to choose misery when we could choose joy. Now, these statements remind me that the struggles in my marriage are all about my way of being, not Steve's. It reminds me to come from, as far as I'm concerned, the problem is me. Now, I don't mean that like in the sense of someone cowering in the corner and, being abused and not standing up for themselves. I mean it from someone who has gone through the work to transcend ego and transcend blame and transcend being right. And say, if I can just look inward, I can solve anything. If I can come from a state of being, of love and acceptance and not making the other person wrong. A second state of being that is helpful, and I find it important, is patience. Now, of course, patience is nice, being patient with your spouse or with your partner, but it's not the kind of patience I'm talking about. We have twin grandkids who are now 14. And when they were 5 years old, one day I took them to swimming lessons to help my daughter out. And I was watching them, and I was quite surprised at my granddaughter's style. First of all, she only used one arm. Why she didn't go in a circle, I don't know. But second of all, she flopped around like a fish on land, only she was in the water. I was really surprised. But also, let me say from May to September, I swim laps for an hour a day, 6 days a week. And I am not fast. In fact, every time the Summer Olympics come on, I say to Steve, you see those Olympians swimming out there? It's hard to tell how fast they're going because they're all fast. They need to put me in one of those lanes and we would all know how fast these swimmers are really going, even the last one. So I'm not fast, but I plug in my waterproof iPod, turn on my audiobook, and off I go for an hour. And I don't flop around and I don't go in circles. I just go. And when I was watching my granddaughter, I realized that some of the things that we do quite easily after years of practice are quite difficult skills when we're first learning them. Have you ever watched a toddler learn to walk? It's quite a feat. And we don't expect a toddler to master it without falling down a lot. Ron and Mary Holnick wrote, "Are we so very different from that small child? The only distinction is that rather than learning to walk, most of us are in the process of learning to love. And what we see, especially at first, are many of what we could call mistakes. So often people are involved in behaviors and attitudes that appear to be anything but loving. However, given the magnitude of what's involved in spiritual evolution, it's wise to bear in mind that learning to love unconditionally takes much more time and is immeasurably more difficult than learning to walk or swim." Now, Steve and I have been married for 44 years. And I can say from experience that it takes time, sometimes decades, to get really proficient at loving. And if it's going to take that long to get really good at loving, we are going to make a lot of mistakes along the way. And in the book, on the chapter on Amy on Love, Marriage, and Life with Steve, I show that sometimes we will do do-overs. And sometimes we have to do a delete day. And I wrote, it's important to forgive often, and forgive well. I'd like to add one more practice, and that is to forgive quickly. In the book Modern Warriors, Peter Hegseth collected stories of 15 modern warriors. Morgan Luttrell, who is the twin brother of Marcus Luttrell, if you're familiar with him from the book or the movie Lone Survivor. He talked about what he went through to become a Navy SEAL. And it was as difficult as it was advertised, and then some. And I think Karan's father was a Navy SEAL, right? Okay, so real people do this, but it's tough. His class started out with 250 guys. 27 of them graduated. This is the defining event. The defining event of this is Hell Week, and it's the toughest training in the U.S. military for 5.5 days of cold, wet, brutally difficult operational conditions. They are receiving operational training on less than 4 hours sleep a night. Only 25% of the SEAL candidates make it through Hell Week. And this is what Luttrell says: "I'll never forget the experience. On one training operation, it went past insanity. We were underwater for 7 hours in 39-degree water." And he says that during that dive, he would have killed himself he actually says, if I could have, I would have probably tried to kill myself. He said there was an experience, though, that was even harder. That we were down to about 80 guys. We had to dig a hole in the beach large enough to conceal ourselves. Then we had to get inside it and avoid detection. As one of the bigger guys, I had to lie at the bottom. I figured that was good. No one could see me, so they couldn't beat on me. I forgot one thing: how much 79 grown men weigh, and that urine flows downhill. After an hour in that pile, we were eventually instructed to leave the hole, get wet, cover ourselves in sand, and put on our uniforms back on. Only we couldn't take time to put on our own clothes. We had to take whatever we could from the pile in 2 minutes. Even if one of us wasn't dressed in that time limit, then it was back in the water. I put on clothes so small it was like I was wearing capris and a crop top t-shirt. He said, I fell to my knees weeping in my hands. I have never been that cold, wet, tired, and miserable before. I wasn't thinking of quitting. I was just having a moment. Says, one of my class officers walked up and hit me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, Luttrell, what's going on?" I said, "Sir, that was one of the most awful nights I have had in my whole life. I have never been. It was horrible." "Damn, son, that was last night. It's morning now. The sun's up. That stuff's over. Let's grab some chow." So way of being number 2, be patient with others and yourselves as you learn to love. When you make mistakes, forgive. Forgive often. Forgive well. And forgive quickly. That stuff's over. Just grab some chow. Third way of being. Now I want to mention that this applies to the first 2, but it especially applies from here on out. And that is that these ways of being are not only valuable in relationships, they're valuable for all of life. But again, especially from this point on. So one of my favorite Steve stories that you may remember, it's happened more than once. He's getting ready to go out, run some errands, do whatever he's going to do. And he comes in. He's saying, "I'm looking pretty good." And I'm like, "Yes, you are." And he says, "Oh, how are these women going to handle it? I'm out there all by myself. It's going to be rough on them." And I say, "You're right. It's going to be rough." And we'll banter back and forth. Got some banter going a little bit. And this one time I got really serious. I guess I didn't yet. I just said, "Now you remember, you belong to me." And he got really serious. And he said, "I would never forget that. You healed me." And I have shared many times that I grew up in this ultra loving home with parents who loved and cherished each other and who thought having a family was the most important thing they could ever do. They were patient, they were kind, they were affirming. They thought each of us was amazing. I grew up with examples of when you have breakdowns, you just fix them. There's no drama, there's no upset, you just do what needs to be done. And I feel really strongly that before I came to this mortal life, that God said, "Okay, I am going to send you down to this amazing home, full of love, with great parents, but it's not so your life will be easy, but so you can be nurtured in love and security, and then you are going to need to go out and be a healer." Life is tough. Most people accumulate a lot of wounds in the process. There is a great need for healers, but there's a catch. Karl Barth has said, "Love is not just an emotion or an ideal. Love is always specific, always costly, and always a miraculous event." The word that might make us quake in our shoes is costly. Love is costly. Healing is costly. I'm going to read this from a book called Bob Goff. "Everybody Always, Becoming Love in a World Full of Setbacks and Difficult People." Okay, he writes, "There's a story in the Bible about Jesus and his friends going across a lake where they met a guy who was a troll to most of the people near him. He was mean, crazy, possessed. Jesus knew exactly what was going on in him, even when the people who lived nearby didn't. You may know what happened. Jesus commanded the evil spirits that were tormenting this man to leave him, and all the evil in him left and went into the pigs, and the pigs ran off a cliff and died. What was a great day for the guy Jesus met was an equally lousy day for a pig farmer nearby, and an even worse day for the pigs. I can almost hear the conversation the farmer must have had that night when his wife asked how his day at work was. Well, it was going great, until a guy landed his boat on the shore and started talking to that crazy guy down by the lake. After a pause, he said, shaking his head, 'Then all 2,000 of our pigs ran off a cliff and died. What? Why? The wife must have asked. The simple answer is he probably didn't know. The real answer was that God was doing something different in someone else's life than he was in their lives. And what he was doing intersected the pig farmer's life in a big way. And it's going to take a lot of grace to accept that sometimes we're the person on the other side of the lake, and other times we're the pig farmer. Often, being a healer means being a pig farmer. It means absorbing pain that isn't yours simply because you love someone who is in pain. So here's another vulnerable comment, or vulnerable moment, comment. The home that we, Steve and I, created for our children was not as stable, not as peaceful, not as ideal as the home I grew up in. And that was hard for me. And it was part of the cost. There are pig farmers who are children of alcoholics or children who were abused that do the work necessary to not pass on the abuse or to heal their family lines. And they pay a price. Let me give you another example. 2 years ago, our son was playing basketball, our son Blake, and he received a serious eye injury. And it triggered constant migraine headaches. It triggered constant black flashes, like 1 or 2 every 60 seconds. All kinds of really difficult and painful things for him. And it was hard to get the right medical attention that he needed. And in the process of it, he went to a retina specialist. And he came to me afterwards. He said, "Mom, this doctor does this amazing treatment. And for anyone who's like looking at screens all the time, looking at computers, it's really, really important and really, really helpful." And I was in the middle of the book at this time. So I am, staring at a computer screen for 8 or 9 hours a day. And I just said, "I'm in. Set me up an appointment." I looked a little bit on the internet of what it was about, but I didn't take a lot of time. I'm just like, yeah, that's my world. I'm going to do this. And when I went to the doctor, she did the procedure, and then she said, "Can you come back tomorrow? I'd like to dilate your eyes." And I thought, that's unique, but sure, I will come back tomorrow. So I came back, she dilated my eyes, she looked at my eyes, and then she started telling me some things. I said, "Now, let me get this straight. You're telling me that I am at risk for macular degeneration." She said, "No, I'm telling you, you have macular degeneration." Now I'm 62 years old, and so that's kind of young for that kind of diagnosis. But she got it really early, and she had me change my diets. She had me take no seed oils in my diet. She has me take supplements that are really good for macular degeneration. I test my eyes daily. And she is really confident that she will be able to keep my corrected vision at 20/40, and I'll always be able to drive and read. But thank goodness there's audiobooks just in case. But here's the important part. When my son went back to his next checkup with her, she said to him, "We almost never pick up on this kind of macular degeneration until it's too late." And when I talked to my son, I said, "I am so sorry that you had to go through so much pain and suffering to save my eyesight." But you did. Blake was a healer, and he paid a price of the 2 most difficult years of his life. Let me tell you about another healer. Could we have picture number 4, please? This is Lorraine Warren. Those of you who are part of the community reading of the Ultimate Coach book may recognize her and know her very well. And you may even know what I'm going to share. But she's an educator, a trainer in peace building. She was honored with the Legacy International Humanitarian Award. But better than the titles, let me share with you who she is. She developed a project called Creating a World That Listens, and she takes red chairs to public places like farmers markets and provides a peaceful space in which she simply listens to the issues and concerns that people have. Everyday people. And often she asks, what would you say if you knew the world would listen? Why does she do this? Because she went to Rwanda and listened to the stories of genocide survivors. And it became her PhD thesis. She had to hear stories of horrendous violence and see man's inhumanity to man up close and very personal. There are stories that she heard of people who were 6, 7, and 8 at the time of the genocide who watched their own families killed. She said one man said, I was old enough to remember, but young enough to hide. He was small enough that he was able to climb up into a tree and be unnoticed. And he watched as his family was massacred. And when the killers left, he climbed down and went body to see if anyone survived. No one did. So he just started walking. He scavenged for food to survive. And Rain said, I heard a lot of stories like that. These are heavy burdens. The cost for the healer is great. Rain said that when she came down, she couldn't even sleep in her bed. She said, I felt like these souls had followed me back home, and I ended up sleeping in my closet. She says, this probably goes back to my parents telling me as a child to pray in my closet. She says, I would pray throughout the night. Another cost. As she listened in Rwanda, she did not have the luxury to break down in tears. She had to hold a space for these people. Another cost, maybe you heard her share this with the Facebook reading group or the community reading group. When she got to her last day, she was exhausted. You can imagine hearing all of these stories. She was emotionally exhausted. She was physically exhausted. And she thought, I am going to spend this last day. I'm going to go shopping. I'm going to enjoy some of the local food. I am going to at least kind of rest up and prepare for this long flight back to the United States. And then the man who had been helping her along the way called her and said there's a woman who had come from a long, long way to tell her story. She's like, no, I'm done. I have enough stories. I need this time. I can't do it. And he shared a little bit more, and she's like, I can't turn her away. And so she agreed. And this woman shared the worst story that Rain had ever heard on this trip. And it was so awful that Rain does not even share the details of it. But in general, as a 6-year-old, this woman watched her mother raped and killed. And then she shared the details with Rain, and Rain's sitting there listening to the details. And she's thinking, oh my goodness, I have a flight that leaves tomorrow. I cannot leave. What do I need to do? Where do I need to go? Who do I need to call? I cannot leave this woman in this trauma. I have to make sure that she is not re-traumatized. And so as she's going through this, suddenly the woman lifts up her head and she has this big smile on her face. And this woman says, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed for courage to tell my story. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and I prayed for someone to listen. You are the answer to my prayer. Listening is an act of love. Listening is an act of healing. We heal others when we listen. We heal others when we love them. We heal others by our being. Wendy Watson Nelson, who is a marriage and family therapist and a professor at BYU, explains why. She writes, structural coupling is a biological term that describes a process through which changes in living systems occur. Structural coupling involves two entities having interactions with each other over a period of time. Each interaction between the two triggers changes. Through this history of interactions, the two distinct entities become more alike, and there's an increasingly better fit over time. Like feet and shoes, like two stones rubbed together, they change in concert with each other. Have you ever noticed that friends can sometimes start dressing alike and talking alike? And couples can sometimes start looking alike. And even dogs and their owners start looking alike. And this just may be because of structural coupling. When you interact with someone repeatedly, and over time it changes you, it changes them. But I want you to consider what this means about our being. Are you seeing what happens when you are love? Are you seeing what can happen when you are healing, when you are kindness? Our love rubs off on another person. Our kindness rubs off on another person. Who we are rubs off on another person. When we structurally couple with that other person, we change who they are. I want you to consider your ways of being and which of these heal as you structurally couple with other people in your life. And remember, if you're going to heal, be willing to pay the cost. All right. A fourth state of being. Is it any surprise that I say I recently read a book? Steve actually put that on our tombstone. I read a book once. That's the variation. And it was called Unoffendable by Brent Hansen. It has such a great title, right? Unoffendable. It was such a great title that I turned it into one of my statements. I, Amy, am unoffendable. And in the book, he has a great story. When Brent lived in South Florida, he had a surfboard, and his friends loaned it to some of their friends, and they ruined it, and they didn't offer to pay for it. He said at that moment he had a choice. He could forgive them, and he, in a sense of justice, would take a hit, or he could refuse to forgive them and try to make them pay for it. In either scenario, someone pays. He didn't tell the end of the story because he said it didn't matter. But here is what matters, and here's what he said. Whenever there's an injury to a relationship, a hurt, a broken heart, or even a broken thing, and you are willing to forgive, you're saying, I got this. I'm going to pick up the bill for this. So think of a time when someone picked up dinner, or when you broke something and someone said, no big deal, I got this. It feels amazing. When I was 17 years old, I was babysitting for our neighbors. The parents went out of town and there were 3 little kids. And for some crazy reason, at the end of their driveway, they had this little triangle thing that they put their trash cans in. Isn't that a stupid place to put it? Because I ran into it in their car. And I was sick. I felt, and I had 2 days to sit on this till they came back. And they came back, and I had to tell them what I did. And they were like, oh, that's no big deal. I'll pick this up. They even still paid me for babysitting. Wow. And it's I'll love them forever. They were gracious. When you live graciously, when you live generously, When you live from, I'll pick this up, it creates a life without keeping score. It creates a life beyond making sure that everything is fair. It's beyond fairness. It's beyond justice. It's mercy. It's grace. It's generosity of the soul. Now, I observed this kind of graciousness in an unlikely place just a few weeks ago. On April 4th, it was the NCAA college basketball finals. It was, the championship game. This is not like the, Final Four. This is it. And it was Kansas versus North Carolina. There were 40 seconds left in the game. Kansas had 70 points. North Carolina had 69. 1-point game. The star center for North Carolina is Armando Bacot, and he rolled his ankle. And it's one of those things that when they show the replays and you look back, everyone just goes, it's like, oh, it had to hurt. And to make it worse, he had had an ankle injury in the previous game. So Bacot is full on hopping on one foot down the court. I had never seen that in a basketball game. 1 foot hop. And what this means is basically Kansas has 5 guys to North Carolina's 4. And with this advantage, Kansas player Jalen Wilson had a wide open 3-point shot. Instead of shooting, instead of finding an open man who could lay it in, Kansas called a timeout, which allows the North Carolina coach to sub out his injured player, get doctors to look at him, but maybe more importantly for basketball aficionados, get back to 5-on-5 players. They threw away their advantage. Remember, Kansas is ahead only by 1 point. The national championship is on the line. There are 40 seconds left in the game. Kansas could lose. And during the timeout, the commentator was saying, he should not have done that. He said, that is when you have to take advantage of the other team. You have to press your advantage. And my thought was, it depends what game you're playing. If your game is bigger than basketball, if it's even bigger than the NCAA championship, if your game is about shared humanity, living with grace, with generosity, you make a different decision. Now, after the game, the internet lit up. Should Kansas have done this? And it does make it a little bit easier because Kansas ended up winning. So it's easier to be gracious after the point, but they didn't do graciousness after the point. And it was interesting to me that most people loved it. And most people said, that is one of the greatest examples of sportsmanship you will ever see. And that was a gracious way of being. So the fifth and final way of being that I think is important for having a wonderful life, I will share now. A woman named Chieko Okazaki shared a story where a dance student went into her class, and when she went in, their teacher had assigned a particular exercise for that day. They had to start at one point in the studio and then go to a second point and then finish at a third point. And they could move any way they wished between points. They could leap, they could roll, they could spin. But whenever they encountered another class member on the way, they had to stop and have some kind of interaction. They could dance together for a few minutes. They could pantomime a fight or a flirtation, anything that included an action and a response. And everyone in the class was assigned 3 different points to start. So their paths crisscrossed in very complicated ways. And the student was very determined to show the teacher how beautifully she could make leaps and pirouettes and reach the 3 points. And she became very frustrated because she kept encountering members of the class and was obliged to interact with them. She felt terribly exasperated when the time for the exercise finished and she hadn't reached her third point. And then she learned that the teacher didn't care if they even reached their second point. The teacher was interested in the creativity and the responsiveness of the dancers' interactions as they encountered each other. Those things that the student thought were interruptions were the only important activities going on. What if the only important activities in our very, very busy lives is our interactions with each other? To love and be loved, to move and be moved by each other's courage, to sorrow with each other's sorrow, to rejoice with each other's triumphs, to belong to each other. I recently discovered this book, 14 Cows for America. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. It was written by Carmen Agradidi, but it was on the story that is shared by Kimberly Naoma. And he writes it. This is a children's book, but he writes his story from his perspective in the back. Could I have picture 5, please? When Kimberly, it's not Kimberly. This is just a group of people from his village. When he was a little boy, he grew up in a small village in Kenya. And when he was little, he fed the nestlings in the bush. And get this, he rescued drowning ants from water puddles. And his mama said he was too gentle to be a fierce Maasai warrior. He especially loved taking care of the cows that belonged to the elders. And he would have loved to have a cow of his own, but his mama was too poor to own one. And he dreamed of the day that he would be able to own a cow. It was his biggest dream. And as a young boy, he spent a lot of time with the grandmas and grandpas, like I said, of the tribe. And they taught him that the Maasai valued not only strength and boldness, but also compassion and kindness towards anyone in need, the orphan, the widow, the stranger. To heal the pain in someone's heart, they told him, you have to give them something that is close in your own heart. When he was older, he won a scholarship to study uni in the United States. And many of the American moms and dads welcomed him into their homes and treated him as they would one of their own children. They showed him kindness by taking him and helping him get an education, and America became his second home. He was in New York City on September 11th, 2001. Like many of us, he saw the devastation, the loss of life, the suffering. His warrior heart could not sit still. He wanted to do something to help. By this time in his life, he had saved up enough money to buy a cow. He decided that this cow would be his offering to the grieving Americans. Why a cow? One, because the cow was a symbol of life to his people. And two, what he said before, to heal the pain in someone's heart, you have to give something that is close to your own heart. But he realized the pain of 9/11 was bigger than his heart. He decided he would ask the elders of his village to bless the cow to make it special, so the gift might take away the sadness from the American hearts. He returned to Kenya the following spring. Now, this village had gotten electricity just shortly before 9/11. Could I have picture 6, please? This is his village. So they just barely had gotten electricity. And believe it or not, many of the Maasai had never even heard about the attack on 9/11. And they definitely never saw the horrific images of planes flying into buildings and people jumping from buildings that were on fire. or firefighters running into buildings that collapsed that were on our televisions. But they listened to the story of what happened in New York City on that tragic day, and they saw the tears that he had, and they were moved. And when he presented his cow for a blessing, others offered up their own precious cows. 14 cows were blessed that day. Now, to understand how big this is, we have to understand what Kimberly says. The cow is almost the center of life for us. It is sacred. It is more than property. You give it a name, you talk to it, you perform rituals with it. I don't know if you have any sacred food in America, something that has a supernatural feel as you eat it. That's the cow for us. And then he shares that when the American ambassador and his wife came to their village to accept the cows, they played the Star-Spangled Banner over the loudspeaker during the ceremony. And he said his people did not understand the song, but they stood with the Americans and placed their hands over their chests. Could I have picture 7, please? He says, seeing hundreds of Maasai standing with him in their traditional red robes and jewelry, some of whom carried banners saying, "To the people of America, we give these cows to help you," made the American diplomat cry. His tears caught the Maasai by surprise, and we were all swept up in the emotion of the moment. A connection between the two cultures had been made. The Maasai felt they had taken some of America's pain into our Maasai hearts. We were helping to heal a people far away. The American diplomats flirted with the idea of shipping these cows to the Central Park Zoo, but that got a little too complicated. So finally, after much deliberation, the American diplomats decided to use the cows to start an education fund for the people of this village. But since the cows were blessed, they could never be slaughtered. So the offspring of these 14 cows are being used to pay for the education of the children of Kimberly's village. The original 14 have become a herd of 35, and the Maasai wish is that every time Americans hear this simple story of 14 cows, they will find a measure of comfort and peace. Here was a village who was moved by the suffering of people they didn't know, but for whom they felt a shared humanity. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills in this way. We've just forgotten that we belong to each other. They remembered they belonged to each other. Currently, there are horrible things being done in the Ukraine. And with the 24/7 news coverage that we have, it's as if we are there. We see the suffering. We see mothers holding their babies and pleading for help. As horrific as this is, there is one good thing that comes. We're reminded that we belong to each other. We are reminded that it matters when other human beings suffer and love is released in the world. In conclusion, let me summarize the states of being that I find valuable in my life. The first states of being are everything. Create who you are and what you do in the world by going to the highest common possibility. In relationships and life, you have to take the good and the bad. Relationships are wonderful practice for creating a state of being that is important to you. For me, it's to be loving, kind, and enlightened. Be patient with yourself as you learn to love. Forgive often, forgive well, and forgive quickly. Consider using your strengths, your way of being, to be a healer, but be willing to pay the cost. Live graciously. Develop a way of being that's, I got that. And remember, we belong to each other. Be willing to be moved and to move other people. Thank you.